Hi, I'm Sabrina, and today I want to talk about the impact of quilting on generations of families. I'll be sharing some significant stories from my own life as well as other members of my family. We'll start with my mom, Jill. She has recorded some audio and sent some photos to share a piece of her story with us.
When I was a little girl, my mom had a really beautiful quilt that my great-grandma had made. I was always fascinated with how she got all those little diamonds to fit together so perfectly. When I was older and learned how to sew a little bit, I wanted to learn how to do something like that, but I was very intimidated and didn't think I would ever be able to do that.
For those of you familiar with the history of eastern Idaho, these two quilt tops made it through the flood from when the Teton Dam burst. They belonged to my great-aunt Emily, who lost her original finished quilt in the flood. They were made as gifts by my great-great-grandmother, who, for all of her grandchildren's weddings, made one of these star quilts. These two are extras she had made before she passed and never finished, but they are beautiful. You can see how intricately each of these is pieced by hand and made so that the points all line up perfectly. I love connecting with these quilts. The photograph quilt belongs to my grandma. When I was up in Washington to visit family, I was able to photograph some of her quilts. When I asked her about this one, she couldn't seem to remember where it was. We searched the whole house, up and down, looked in cupboards and drawers, and couldn't seem to find it. My grandma was devastated and assumed that she had lost it in one of her many moves. While I was talking and getting the history of another quilt, my mom came down and said that she had found it. Someone had put it in the cleaning closet, the one place we didn't look. This quilt is over 60 years old. It had made it through several moves between 3 states, and it is a cherished piece of my grandma's. The other quilt I mentioned is a green applique quilt imaged here. At one time, my great-grandma was a youth group leader over several teenage girls. Each girl had made a hand-appliqued quilt block and stitched their names into it. It was so fun to listen to my grandma tell me something about each of the ladies featured in the quilt. After all of the girls had given their quilt blocks, my grandma turned them into a quilt. She hand-stitched the pattern, ironically, on a grace frame. It was so fun because a few of the girls didn't make it to the original quilt, so they turned in their blocks later, and she had to hand-stitch on top of the existing quilt. It was funny to see how my grandma did her binding. She was not a fan of mitered corners, and I don't know if it was just that she didn't know how or if she didn't want to, but you can see that the corners are just a simple fold. I love looking at older quilts just to see how the techniques have changed and grown over the years.
My grandmother made quilts often for her grandchildren using faux fur on the back, and on the top she used a big piece of some sort of fabric that was usually polyester of some kind, and she called them snuggle blankets, and they were very snuggly. I remember she would set up big quilting frames and have all of her friends come over, and they would hand tie all of the quilts together, and I have very fond memories of doing that with my grandmother. When I had children of my own, I wanted to make a pieced quilt. I was still fascinated with my great-grandmother's quilt. So I watched a lot of quilting shows and learned a little by little. Eventually, I asked a friend who was a wonderful quilter to help me to make a quilt for my daughter. So she had me come over to her house, and we cut everything out with a rotary cutter, which I had never used and was so fascinated by, and then pieced it together. It was an Irish chain baby quilt, and I felt so successful. In the end, it turned out so beautiful, and I was really proud of it. And then one of the first quilts I made on my own was a denim quilt with a star inlay pattern. And I had gotten old blankets to use for the batting, and I think I had a fleece backing on it. It was before Minky came out, or I would have done that. But it had a star inlaid pattern, and it was very beautiful and very, very heavy. And it was a favorite of all of my kids. They really loved it. We would take it to ball games, and even the cold wind, nothing penetrated that thing. So they all wanted one. And I think over the years I was able to make each one of them one, or I taught them how to make their own.
I love my denim quilts. I brought it here today, and it's so fun to see the progression of how all of these denim quilts were made differently. You can see the one my mom made versus the one she made for my brother, but even looking at the difference between how I did mine. My Aunt Tiffany at one time showed her how to rip the jeans differently, so you didn't have to cut them out into squares and sew them all together. You could rip them all the way up the pant leg and make these nice, easy blocks. It's even fun. I took a swatch from my dad's jeans, as well as one of his pockets, which is perfect for keeping snacks in at a baseball game, or even keeping the remote in so you don't lose it. And then this was on the inside of one of his pockets. It was kind of fun to see the history of the Levi's jeans. So I keep these on there stitched perfectly, and it has whales on the back. It was my favorite, working with my mom to find all of these pieces, to get together and to learn how to quilt it and to tie it by hand. I did not want to machine quilt this because we didn't have access to a long arm at that time, but it's fun to see all of the little ties that I spent hours and hours working on.
I think making quilts are treasures for people to keep, and I love it when I see one of the quilts that I've made being used and loved by someone. Over the years, I have given away many, many blankets, especially baby blankets, and I even have donated some for auctions. Once I learned how to machine quilt on my own projects, a whole new world opened up to me. It was not doing the hand things. It was not trying to roll it all up and make it fit. It was much, much easier and really, really beautiful results. I think I learned how to use ruler work, and that also was very fun. And when I learned how to do curved piecing, it was a lot of fun as well. I think that doing small projects to start with and doing things bigger and bigger, maybe start with a pillow cover or a table runner like I did, and build on your knowledge and do bigger things as you go. They work a lot better than doing something really complicated and something that will end up in your sewing room for decades. Those are not the kind of projects that I like. I like things that can get done. But I do feel really grateful to live in a time when so much technology makes quilting easier. I use a rotary cutter, have very nice sewing machine. I have all the gadgets and rulers I could get my hands on, but my grandmother and my great-grandmother used newspaper and tissue paper patterns and sewed by hand, using scissors and flour sacks and clothing they cut up to use for piecing. And they were nowhere near as accurate as what we have now, but the things that they made were just as beautiful and have stood the test of time.
Every summer growing up, we would spend at least a week in Sugar City, Idaho with my great-grandma. We would go to Porter's craft store, which is now out of business, and get materials for our projects. Then we would sew together. I learned the basics of sewing on a machine, hand stitching, crochet, and hand embroidery. A little while back, I was able to travel up to my great-aunt's house. When my great-grandmother passed away, Emily inherited a lot of her patterns. I was able to go through the box, and it unlocked so many memories. She had manila envelopes of applique patterns and newspaper clippings. She had clippings from 1959, as well as handwritten patterns. It's been years since my grandma passed away, but being able to see her handwriting and read that again made me feel so connected to her. Since that visit, I've been working on a way to digitize her patterns and her applique process to include using a die cut machine to cut out the pieces and draw the faces of the fruit so it would match perfectly.
I think if you start with easy projects and build up on your knowledge, watch YouTube videos, and get a friend that knows how to quilt. Most of them absolutely love sharing what they know, and they get so excited when someone gets the quilting bug. That I think if you do those kinds of things, one day you will leave beautiful things for your children, and hopefully they will be able to continue that legacy. So I have my great-grandmother that I know of, maybe more, but my great-grandmother, my grandmother, my mother, who sewed more garment sewing, and then I love to quilt, and my daughters have all learned to quilt, and now I'm teaching my granddaughter. So I think quilting is a blessing that can be loved for many, many generations.
Thank you for that, Mom. Quilting truly is a blessing. It's the gift that keeps on giving. And now we have a chance to hear from my niece, Haley.
One reason I really wanted to start quilting was because I would go downstairs when my grandma and Sabrina were quilting downstairs, and I always thought it was so amazing to watch them quilt downstairs, and I always wanted to make something of my own. So one day I asked Grandma, I was like, "Hey Grandma, can I make a quilt?" And she said we could make something because I was going to my Mima's to go camping. And so we put together a denim quilt. We put some my grandma put some flowers, and I made a little square piece with a tent, a heart, and some trees. And I thought it was the coolest project ever. And I told all my friends that I had made a blanket. It was so cool, and I loved it. It was just small, but I still loved it because it was hard to do the stitching. And also, then after that, I wanted to make more quilts or do more projects. So I asked my grandma one day, "Hey, can we do more quilts together?" She said maybe. So for Christmas, I got a sewing machine, and I was so excited to make my own projects. So I had to learn the learning curves of using a sewing machine. I had to learn how to thread it and how to use all the foots and the needles to do it right. And then Sabrina called me and she FaceTimed me, and she taught me how to make a really pretty strip quilt. And we are still working on that at the moment. We're still working on that strip quilt. And I also love to I asked my grandma if we could do some hexies because I had seen her do English paper piecing hexies. So she taught me how to do it, and Sabrina taught me her way how to do it. And I've been still doing that, and it's so fun. That is why I love quilting so much.
Thank you, Haley, for telling us about your quilt. I remember sewing with my mom when I was just a little girl. She had made a strip quilt, and she let me be her good little ironer. But when she was done, she let me use her scraps to make a rug and a blanket for my new dollhouse. The fun part is, my nieces still play with it to this day, 16 years later. Before I end, I wanted to make a point that quilting can impact families even if we don't all quilt together. I know a lot of people that feel the impact of quilting on their families that don't actually quilt themselves. The gift of a quilt can be just as meaningful as a shared quilting experience. My sister is one of those people, and she has allowed me to share a portion of her story. Most people in my family are what you might call creatives, but not all of us are quilters. Heidi is a talented crafter and hobby sewer. She makes beautiful things, but she does not consider herself a quilter. However, she does respect the art and talent involved when it comes to making quilts. She has received many quilts from family members for herself and for her son. Being gifted a quilt means the world to her because she knows the thought and effort that goes into making a handmade creation. She has one that we call the Green Fuzzy that came from our great-grandma. This is her favorite blanket because it reminds her of the summers we spent with our grandma that has since passed away. Heidi also has a Goodnight Moon quilt made by that same great-grandma that her son loves to play on and snuggle up in. Even though he never had the opportunity to meet his great-great-grandma, he can still feel connected to her. So quilters, even if you don't think you're making an impact now, keep quilting. You never know how your creations will impact future generations. Thank you for allowing me to share my story and the story of my family. We hope you enjoy the rest of your fall festival.